The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may happen to be. My name is Nick Connell and I'm an Associate Consultant with Brandwood Biomedical. Welcome to this month's Brandwood Live webinar on Asia-Pacific product labelling. The webinar today will be given by our CEO and Senior Consultant, Grant Bennett, who will be presenting all the way from the US following his successful presentation on product labelling at RAPS in San Jose. Just to give you a little bit of background on Grant, Grant provides expert consultancy services related to regulatory compliance in Australia, New Zealand and the Asia Pacific with Brandwood, and is also responsible for management oversight of all of our Australian consulting projects. Grant joined Brandwood Biomedical in 2013, bringing with him about 15 years experience in medical devices, gained from working with the TGA, a senior management role with the US headquartered multinational supplier of medical devices, and membership and participation in the Regulatory Affairs Expert Panel, the National Advisory Council for AusMedTech, and the Regulatory Guidance Development of the Asian Harmonization Working Party. Now, just before we begin, I'd like to say a couple of words about Brandwood Biomedical. For those that don't know us, we're a medical devices and IVDs regulatory, reimbursement and clinical consultancy that brings a global perspective to the regulatory applications of our clients' products. We have offices in Sydney and China, but also in New Zealand, Hong Kong and Taiwan, all of which are supported by a global network of trusted partners that we work with to deliver a global service to our clients. Now, to achieve this, we think it's important that we do two things really well. And firstly, is that we are highly engaged with the industry and with the regulators. And secondly, that we are highly networked, which means we actively participate in the provision of training and support to regulatory agencies. We provide input to guidance and policy development, and we support industry associations. For example, our senior management and consultants are heavily involved with the Chinese FDA, the Asian Harmonization Working Party, and here in Australia with biotech industry associations to foster their relationships with the TGA. This is particularly important because it means we then have a much clearer understanding of what's going on in the industry, as well as gaining understanding of the regulator's perspective, which helps the TGA get to know us a little bit better and builds a relationship of trust and credibility. Now that's just a little bit about the way that we like to do business and the kind of outlook and goals that we have for ourselves, but I'd like to move on to the webinar. So firstly, just a little bit of housekeeping. You should be looking at a screen something like this. Now this is the webinar that Grant is about to start, and you should see a little orange arrow in the top right hand corner. If you click that orange arrow, the control panel will expand. If you have a question at any point during the presentation, type it into this little box where it says enter a question for staff. We'll receive and collate all of those questions, and at the end of the webinar we'll go through as many of them as we can so that we can have a live Q&A with Grant. If we don't get through all of the questions, don't worry, because everyone will receive a follow-up email with a link to the slides, a recording of the webinar, and also written answers to all of the questions that are received. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our CEO and Senior Consultant, Grant Bennett, who's going to tear down the proverbial Tower of Babel that is the Asian Pacific product labelling. Grant, I'm now going to hand over control to you.
Thanks, Nick. Well, good morning to everyone that's throughout Australia and Asia, and to those that are stateside, good afternoon. As Nick said, I'm currently based out of California. I've attended San Jose RAPS Convergence Conference over the last few days, which has been a fantastic conference. Got a chance to meet hopefully many of you that are actually on the webinar, and was able to present predominantly the same information that I'm going to present in this. So I do apologise for anyone that's jumped on that attended yesterday, but you know, please stay on if you like. The agenda for today's webinar, we're going to have a look at the Asia Pacific, what makes it up, have a look at the GHTF influence and how the Global Harmonisation Task Force has influenced the requirements around labelling specifically for Asia Pacific. We'll also look at a few specific examples around some of those jurisdictions and look at the local differences amongst those jurisdictions as well. And finally, we'll have a brief discussion around how you can actually manage all of those different jurisdictions. So, Asia Pacific. Over 30 countries and over 15 major languages. For any manufacturer that's looking to import into the Asia Pacific region, this causes substantial headaches. The number of variations across, although some of them do have some similarities, most of them do have their own specific requirements that you need to consider as you're heading down the path of registrations and distribution in those countries. We look at some of the areas or groups that cover the Asia Pacific region. I mainly draw your attention to AHWP, or the Asian Harmonization Working Party. Most of the Asian jurisdictions do actually fall within this group. AHWP has been running for a number of years now. For those that haven't been involved or haven't seen it, Brandwood does get involved with this group. It currently consists of roughly 27 countries and brings regulators and industry together to discuss these requirements and how the regulations in those jurisdictions can evolve. So when we look at the definition from the GHGF or what's now the IMDRF, the definition is very clear and mainly comes from the 13485 standard, and that's actually flowed into the ASEAN Medical Device Directive. So the directives currently gives guidance to regulators throughout Asia as to what is required in the labels and how they're to be applied throughout those regions. The ASEAN Medical Device Directive is not compulsory, it's more of a guidance for those regulators. Labelling, I'm sure, as you all would be aware, can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. It can be the device label. We also consider the IFU that's provided with most products, even down to the box cartons and marking collateral as well. They're all things that certainly throughout Asia are considered labelling. So if we look at Australia specifically, Australia does use the essential principles, although similar to Europe, it does have its own specific requirements, and manufacturers need to be aware of those. Today we look specifically at Essential Principle 13, which is looking at the labelling requirements, the information provided, the location, and also the IFU. So 13.1 is the general information that's required. Again, this is fairly common across most jurisdictions throughout Asia. Information such as device, manufacturer. With the manufacturer, you do need to remember that some of these jurisdictions do differ between legal manufacturer and the actual manufacturing, the location, and in some of those countries, which we'll go through shortly, you do actually need to include the specific manufacturer's details. You have the IFU, any specific requirements around the IFU, looking at things like the size of the text provided, the symbols, and also how it's actually provided. So that's your labelling, looking at whether you can just provide it as part of a web content. 13.2 looks at the location of that information. So the TGA require it to be on the device unless it's impractical to do so. In that case, you then need to look at applying that labelling information into the primary packaging. On the outer packaging, if you're providing multiple devices, you can provide it on a leaflet, or you can actually use other appropriate media. Now, some of the things that need to be considered here is TGA does not consider not putting it on the device itself acceptable due to financial reasons. And I say that specifically around sponsorship labelling. There is requirements in Australia to apply your local sponsor onto the device. I know some people use such information as the invoices that go out with the sponsor information and determine that that's acceptable. TGA would need to see evidence as to why it could not be applied to the product itself. So you do need to keep that in mind. With the sponsor labelling, it can actually be applied onto the carton or onto the device itself after it's actually brought into the country, and it's not considered manufacturing under Australian requirements. I'm not going to go through each of the details as to what's required under the Australian IFU inclusions. As Nick had said earlier on, all of these slides will be provided after the presentation. but it does give you a very good, thorough list of information around the specific information that needs to be included. Looking at China, as most on this call have probably attended some of our webinars previously that Stephen Wen, our Director of Operations, has hosted. 2014 saw some substantial changes with the release of Order 650 from the CFDA in China. That brought with it a number of various requirements that you need to consider as a manufacturer, and as part of those requirements is the manual and labelling requirements for importing product into China. Regulation number 6, article number 8. So again, I'm not looking at the entire regulation itself. We're just going to look at the specific articles that are affected by or are created for labelling. So article number 8, device generic name must comply with the CFDA naming rules. So it's very, very specific requirements around naming conventions. What you'll see through a number of these slides is the requirements looking at the specific details. So registration details, manufacturers' names, they must be exactly the same as what's provided on the registration once you actually gain approval in China. Must have the license details on for class 2 and 3. You must also include your product technical requirements, or PTR, on the labelling for those types of devices, and also your composition and intended use statements as well. Article 13 looks at the actual plate or the device label and requiring the manufacturer's details. Notice here it's actually the contract manufacturer's details that's required, and also the registration certificate reference. Article 16, when you update a user manual in China, so obviously as part of your application to the CFDA you actually include your IFU in its translated form. In China, any of those changes do require to be notified, and the notification process is a submission to CFDA. If you don't receive any feedback from the CFDA after 20 days, generally speaking, it's actually approved by the agency unless you hear otherwise. So again, just looking at some of those details, the device generic name must comply with those the naming conventions and regulations. Class 2 and 3 devices, they need to be consistent with the device registration. So being a stickler for detail, I have seen products held up because they've got a decimal point in the wrong position, or a street name or something is misspelled. So you do need to be considerate of that and make sure those details are absolutely correct. Again, all labelling needs to be provided in Chinese. Article 10 outlines the detail, so the specific details that are required as part of that labelling and IFU. So again, similar to some of the other jurisdictions, device names and models, manufacturers' details and addresses. Your legal agent in China, you do need to include that information. The license details that we spoke about previously, the PTR reference, which is part of your submission to CFDA or application, and your product performance. Article 11 outlines the warnings and precautions that need to be part of your IFU or label. Looking primarily at one of the key things, I guess, that differs from other jurisdictions, so most of the things are the same, single-use sterilisation instructions, but potential adverse events from normal use is something that you actually need to include into that as well. Article 13, again, it's looking at the detail of the product, or the plate, as they call it, or the device label. Product name and model and specifications, the legal agent details need to be included, manufacturer's details, including address. You need to include the contract manufacturer's details, registration details, and again, it's very important that this information is accurate to try and ensure any or avoid any delays that you may see from doing the import. Storage conditions and environmental warnings, and any other warning labels that need to be included. Note, there is a few points there that you can actually refer to the product manual IFU if your space is limited, which is generally the case for a lot of products. again, just coming back to the update of user manuals, they must be notified to the CFDA with a comparison table. That comparison table outlines the differences between what was submitted to the CFDA during the original registration, and then looks at what those variations are, and then also looking, if you don't receive any questions back from the CFDA, after 20 days, the changes are deemed as accepted. So label details must match the approval. So again, I've said that a few times, but it's very, very critical, and it will help you avoid any delays. It is reviewed during importation. Now, it is acceptable in China that if some specific China labelling needs to happen once it arrives in the country, you can do that before it's cleared customs. So that can be arranged through your local distributor or license holder. And e-labelling is not actually deemed as acceptable in China on its own. So it can be used, but obviously primarily it needs to be provided in the format that's required. So India, I've got a few slides on India. India is obviously an evolving regulatory framework. So there was guidance released in July 2016. There is requirements for specific types of devices in India. Generally, most of these devices will use internationally accepted labels, medical device labeling. Also need to consider that some devices, what we consider devices, certainly in Australia and the US, may actually be considered as considered as drugs in India. The current specific requirements. So there's no, as I indicated earlier on, there's no actual specific labelling requirements as such. It is acceptable to use international standards for labelling requirements. They must be imported into India as medical equipment and obviously pay customs and duty taxes and those sorts of things for them to go through. And you do actually require a local distributor to import the product and sell it. Draft requirements. I'm not going to go through each of these slides. Again, they're going to be available at the end. The draft requirements does call out some specific labelling. Similar to as I indicated earlier, a lot of these requirements do actually come from what we consider as normal requirements, device labelling, sterilisation, those sorts of things, precautions. So at this stage, there are exemptions for medical devices for export from India. There is some requirements around shelf life. So in India, there is some regulations around the import of devices that have a use-by date and a limitation as long that can be. And so you can actually import product for not for clinical use and demonstration prior to registration. On to Japan. There is requirements for labelling in Japan. Specifically is an update that requires a package insert for Class 4 devices in Japan. So the package insert needs to be notified to MAH prior to actually marketing it. So you do need to provide that package insert before you can proceed with your approval and distribution of the product. The content of the package insert actually needs to be posted on the PMDA website basically as soon as it's been approved. Draft insert, you do need to provide that as part of your application, and again, if that changes, there is a notification requirement, and it can actually be integrated into the IFU if space is limited. Some of the information that is required on the package insert, again, like most, there is similarities, so such things as warnings, directions for use, looking at storage conditions and expiry dates, and those sorts of things are required to be on the package insert. Again, you can actually include that into your IFU if that would make it an easier process, which I suspect it would. E-labelling is acceptable, so you can actually use e-labelling for your products. It needs to meet all of the relevant requirements, but a little slight variation is you actually have to have customer agreement that the label is acceptable. So just summarising some of those points that we've just run through on a few of those jurisdictions. Core requirements do come from the GHTF guidelines, and most of those jurisdictions, specifically looking at the ASEAN Medical Device Directive, they have actually come from the GHTF, which does help align some of those requirements. It's important to understand your local, the local requirements in each of those jurisdictions. They do have their own minor requirements, some of those things minor requirements, and others are major, such as including registration details onto the label. Actually cause some problems for manufacturers, as it does end up resulting in a number of different part numbers. Think about other requirements as well, not just the medical device requirements around labelling, but also your customs requirements. So things like different materials may have restrictions or may have other notifications that are needed. Working with your logistics department will actually help with understanding some of those. And working with the logistics department will actually help them understand what the requirements are before they're shipping product. Consider tabling the information. So what we do have and what we saw here in RAPS in San Jose was some really good examples around how you can table the information. Now, most of us on the call are probably from a regulatory background and do understand that the requirements both from a registrations, language and labelling perspective are very large. But having those in a table, such as an Excel spreadsheet, can actually make that process a lot easier. And identifying jurisdictions that may have all the same requirements and enable you to launch in those countries a little sooner. Another point is ensure you've actually got a competent partner. One of the challenges that we see at Brandwood is companies that don't have the either resource or capabilities to manage some of these jurisdictions, registrations, and meeting those requirements. So be sure that the partner that you're with does have experience in the jurisdiction. Ensure they understand it, because it can save you some pain later on when you actually go into market where the regulator may actually identify some issues with your labelling, for example, and potentially cause problems with your existing registrations. You'll also find that most jurisdictions do actually consider international standards as acceptable. So you can certainly use those for symbols and labelling requirements. As I said earlier on, this is just a quick snapshot with regards to the table that you can use. These can be really useful, and certainly something that's useful for marketing divisions and enabling them to actually consolidate some of their marketing plans and launch plans in the future, and how they may be able to launch into some of those other jurisdictions and countries sooner, considering they've got the same information requirements. That actually brings me to the end of the slides. Again, if for those that were at the RAPS conference yesterday, it was very similar information. So I hope this was informative. And I think I will now hand it back to Nick so we can take any questions. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you very much for that great presentation, Grant. As you mentioned, we'll now be moving on to the Q&A segment of this webinar, where Grant will answer some of the questions that have been submitted throughout the course of his presentation. So firstly, Grant, the first question comes from Jeffrey, who asks, with regard to China, do I as a manufacturer need any specific addresses on the labels, either under current requirements or the future draft guidance?
All right, thanks, Jeffrey. That's a good question. Look, the China labelling can be complex. It does actually require your contract manufacturing details. You actually also need your local agent details on there as well. So you need to consider that. They do need to be provided and translated into Chinese as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Grant. The next question comes from Angelica, who asks, can our distributor in China add the specific label requirements on after arriving in India at customs warehouse?
Sorry, you said China and India. I would say at this stage, for China, yes, you can. Once it actually hits customs, you can have your local agent or another party actually provide and apply any of those labelling requirements before it's actually accepted into the country. India, as it indicated, there's no specific requirements at this stage except for the normal international requirements. So thanks for the question.
Great. Thank you. Next question comes from Catherine. In Australia, I understand it's a requirement to include the sponsor's details or local representative details and contact information prior to importing. Is this correct? And also, can the local company just provide the details on their invoice or order forms to meet this requirement?
Okay, thanks for that. So there is requirements around sponsor information being provided. The rationale for requiring that information is to enable the users of the devices to actually have somebody to contact that is not outside of Australia. So it's important that that information is provided, again, similar to what we'd spoken about earlier, at the lowest level of packaging if possible. Some companies, as I suggested, do actually use an invoice. There needs to be justification as to why you're applying that sponsor information to the invoice. TGA is generally not completely happy with that approach, but again, if you've got the justification, then it wouldn't be a problem. You also need to consider whether or not you can actually include it into the IFU as part of that as one alternative. So thank you for that question.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Grant. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit short on time. It's a bit of a shorter webinar this month, but I think we've got time for one last question. Simon asks, simply, is e-labelling acceptable in Australia?
Thanks, Simon. So, look, you can use it. The way the regulations outline the requirements around what information needs to be provided. Now, the format that it is provided in really needs to be determined by the manufacturer. So some of the considerations that need to be taken into account, the risk is certainly important. The higher risk products obviously may need more information. You also need to consider the users of the devices. So in those cases, if the device is simple and straightforward for a nurse to use, for example, you may not need to provide as much information as you would with other higher risk products as well to those users. So thank you for that question.
Okay, great. Yeah, unfortunately that's all the time we have for today. I notice there's quite a few questions, but they'll be answered and sent out later on. Just before we go, I'd like to give a big thanks to Grant for that informative presentation, but also to all of our attendees today for taking the time out to learn a little bit about product labeling in the Asia Pacific with us. As I just mentioned, a copy of the slides, a recording of the webinar, and then also written responses to all of the questions that have been received will be sent out in a follow-up email. So thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Take care.